Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and this is the first of 4 videos in a new, exciting series on creating an app that uses AppIntents to enhance the usability of our app. More and more iPhone users expect our apps to use the latest iOS features, so we're going to be adding a widget and the ability to update our app without having to open the app, and SiriShortcuts, so that we can even use our voice to invoke shortcuts to trigger the same actions. Now, these are going to be 4 fairly long videos, so hang in there and use the chapter links in the description to pause and come back when you're ready. I love getting your feedback, so if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment below. Make sure you ring the bell to enable notifications and get notified whenever a new video is released. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. A link is in the description. Over the next 4 videos, we're going to be creating a very simple iOS app that allows us to create a tally object that only has 2 properties, a name and a counter. When you select the tally object and tap on the counter, it increases by 1. A double tap will decrease by 1. And then tapping on the clearance button will clear that counter. And that's all we're going to be covering in this first video. In the next section, which will be 2 videos, we'll focus on widgets, configurable and dynamic. Now, when you tap on one of these widgets, it will use the app intent to increment the counter. Tapping outside of the counter will open the app and navigate directly to that specific tally, and you'll see that the counter has been increased here too. And this is the dynamic nature of widgets introduced for iOS 17. In addition, back on the home screen, we can long press on the home screen to bring up the edit capabilities and add a new widget. And notice that I have a small widget for MyTallies, and I can add it to the home screen. And then long pressing on the widget allows me to configure this widget by choosing any one of my configured tallies. These configurations are available due to AppIntents. Well, now that I have 2 on my home screen, I can tap on either one to increment the tally, and then tapping outside of the counter will launch the app and navigate to that specific tally. Updating either one of these 2 will also update the corresponding widget version. And then in the 3rd section, or the 4th video of this series, we'll introduce SiriShortcuts. With SiriShortcuts, we can use our voice to command any one of our tallies to increment simply by specifying it by name. What our app does behind the scenes is create shortcuts for our app. So let's try it out. Update alpha with MyTallies.
Updated alpha to 14.
Update beta with MyTallies.
Updated beta to 4.
If you do not specify a name, you get a picker. Increase a tally with MyTallies.
Select a tally to update, alpha, beta, or gamma. Updated gamma to 7.
So this is what we're going to be covering in this series. So let's get started. There is a starter project for this video, and you can download it from the link in the description. There will be several branches by the end of this series, so make sure you download the starter project for this project, as it has the starter resources. The iOS branch contains the completed source code for this video, and will also serve as the starter course source code for the next video, should you wish to start there. You can just download and expand the zipped archive. The project does require Xcode 16. Now, the only thing that this starter project has that a vanilla new project doesn't have is that I've changed the accent color to black and white, depending on whether or not you're in light or dark mode. I've added an app icon and an image that I can use for my launch screen, and a corresponding launch screen storyboard showing the image in the center. And I've changed the background to a system background color, so it too will change with the color scheme. So if you're starting with your own new project, that is fine. You just won't have my images or accent color. We'll be using SwiftData to persist our tallies. So let's first create a model and some mock data so that we can see what our app looks like in the previews. So let's create a Swift file, and we're going to call that file tally. And then when it opens, we'll import SwiftData. And then we'll create a class called tally and make sure that we decorate it with the @model macro. Now, as I mentioned in the demo, the model is only going to have two properties, a name, which is a string, and a value, which is an int. That's the counter. And then we can let Xcode create the initializer for us, but I'm also going to provide an initial value of 0 for the value. Now, there are going to be 3 actions associated with each instance. 1 to increase the value, 1 to decrease it, and 1 to reset it back to 0. So the first function for increase, we'll just add 1 to the value. We'll need 1 for decrease, but in this case, we'll want to make sure that we don't decrease it anything less than 0. So if the value then is greater than 0, we can subtract 1. And then the reset function is pretty simple. All we do is reset the value to 0. So now I want to create some mock data. So I'm going to create a static property called MockTallies that will be an array of tally. And since we provide an initial value for the initializer, we can create one instance without having to provide a value. For the second instance, though, I want to provide one. So our alpha will be at 0, but the beta is going to start at 10. So now we'll need to create a preview modifier that's going to allow us to use these two objects in a model container. But I want that model container to be in memory only. Now, in 2 recent videos, I've shown you how to do this with mock data. And I'll leave links to both of these videos in the description. And the process was the same each time, so I'll leave it up to you to watch those 2 videos, but I've created a gist view that you can use to create a snippet, as I've done, and you can find it here. So in my preview container folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it MockData. I'm just going to remove this foundation import. And then my snippet is an _MD, and that snippet will be used. And all I have to do is replace model with my model, which is a tally. And then next in the space where I have a comment where I ask you to insert objects here, I'll use my tally mock tallies and a for each loop to iterate through each one of these and use the insert to insert them into the container using the main context insert method. And as you can see, this container is stored in memory. Now we can start designing our app. So the first thing I'm going to do is rename my content view to something more descriptive like TallySelectionView. And since we're using SwiftData, I'll import SwiftData. And then I'm going to create a query that has a sort based on the tally name key path that'll generate an array of tally. And now that we have our query, we can use that trait modifier so that we can see what we're doing when we build our preview. So the traits in the preview will be our mock data. Well, it's here that I want to present a selection of tallies available, if there are any. So I want to use a picker. So I'm going to need a private state variable that will be called selected tally, but it's going to be optional. Okay, so let's start our UI. Let's replace the body with a navigation stack. Inside there, I'll create a VStack. The first view in the VStack will create a picker where the text is select your tally. And the selection is going to be bound to that selected tally state property. Now this string won't be seen, but it's there for good reasons for screen readers. For the views, we'll need a text view to tell the users to select the tally if none is selected. So we can do that and set the tag to be nil as an optional tally. Then we can use a for each loop on tallies to get a tally iterator that we can use to create another text view. And that will display the tally name, and the tally iterator will be the tag, again as an optional tally, since selected tally is optional. Notice how my mock tally names are now in that picker? That's because of the preview trait. Well, I'm going to apply a button style of bordered, and I'll add some padding around it. Below this, I'm going to add a spacer, and then a navigation title to the VStack, and I'll just use the string MyTallies. Now, the first time someone launches your app, there won't be any tallies to pick from. So you should display a content unavailable view. Otherwise, you can display your picker and have them select one of them. So let's embed the picker and the spacer in an if-else clause, where if tallies is empty, and then the else contains your picker and spacer. And then within the if clause, we'll create a content unavailable view using the string create your first tally, and I'll use an image, and that can be that Mac 256 image that I have in my assets that I uploaded to the assets folder. Well, testing now, nothing will change in your preview because we are using the preview traits. If you temporarily remove that, you'll see that the content unavailable view is displayed. Below the picker and above the spacer, I want to design my value view that I can tap on to update the value. So I want this to be a reusable view, though, because I want to be able to use this later on in my widgets. So the font size that I will use in the widget will be much smaller than the font size that I'm going to use here in the iOS view. So I'll need to pass in a font size as a variable when I display the view. And also, since I'm going to be tapping on this view while in iOS, I'll need to pass in the selected tally as a bindable object. So let's create a new view, and I'm going to call it SingleTallyView. And then I'll import SwiftData. We'll create that size variable as a let, and it's going to be a double. And then my tally variable is going to be a bindable tally. Now the preview is going to complain because it needs these values. Well, we could create a traits modifier here and perform a previewable query in our preview and use one of our mock objects, but that's not really necessary here. We'll create a previewable at state variable called tally and just create a sample tally, leaving the value at 0. And then we'll pass in a fixed size of 100 as our bindable state object. In the body, I'll create a text view using the tally.value. I'm going to apply a font using a system size of that size. The weight is going to be heavy, and a design is going to be rounded. I'll then apply a monospace digit modifier and set the content transition to numeric text. And this is going to have our numbers change, kind of like a digital clock. And then in the case that the number gets too large, I'll just apply a minimum scale factor of 0.5 to keep it within our view itself. And then I'll apply some padding. I'll set a frame to a width of 1.5 times the size and 1.5 times the height. Then I'm going to apply a background that's a rounded rectangle. I'm going to set the corner radius to 20. And then I'm going to have a fill that's a clear color, but a stroke using a primary color and a line width of 5. And then we can apply an on-tap gesture to the view within an animation block. And then within that animation block, we'll call that Tally's increase function. And then this might sound controversial, but I'm actually going to force a save here because I'm finding that in Xcode 16, the automatic save is just taking too long and it really messes up my design. So before we do that, we'll need to first grab the model context from the environment. Now the problem is we haven't injected our model into the environment yet because we've been working in our in-memory traits model. So back at the app entry point, I'm going to need to import SwiftData and then use the model container function to pass in that model for Tally itself so that that context is now going to be in the memory in the environment. So I'll return to my SingleTallyView now and I'll create a context variable from the environment's model context key path. So now within that on-tap gesture, I can issue a call to the try optional context.save. Well, I can create another on-tap gesture. I'm just going to copy this one. But this time, I'm going to specify a count of 2. And then instead of calling the increase function, I'm going to call the decrease one. Well, you can test this out now in the preview, and you'll see that it works. A single tap increases, and a double tap decreases. So we can return to our TallySelectionView, and then below the picker and the padding, we can create an instance of that new SingleTallyView. But first, we have to check to see if the selected tally is not nil. So if it isn't, we'll create that SingleTallyView, passing in a size of 100. And since the selected tally can't be nil, we can pass it in with a forced unwrapping. We know that's okay though because we've checked to see that it's not nil. You can see that we can select the tally, but if I tap here, the preview crashes, and that's probably because our actions are in a different view with a different context. No matter though, we know that it's working. Our design is looking good. So below the SingleTallyView, then I want to create my reset button. So I'm going to leave the action empty first, but for the label, I'm going to use a label itself with the string reset and a system image that is the arrow counterclockwise. I'll set the font size to title. I'll set the button style to bordered. And for the frame, I'll set a max width of infinity with an alignment of trailing. Back to the button's action here, it's going to be very similar to what I did in the increase or decrease. We'll use an animation block. And then I'll apply the reset function to the selected tally. And then if I want to save this, it will mean that I need the context from the environment again. So back at the top of this view, we'll create an environment using the model context key path to create the variable context. And then within the animation block, after I've reset, I'll try to use the context save. So if we select a tally, we can see the button, but it looks like I need to add some padding. The last thing we have to do is to allow our user to create a tally and then test on our simulator that our tallies are persisting. So let's create a new SwiftUI view, and I'm going to call it NewTally View. Let's import SwiftData. And since we'll be inserting a new tally here, we'll also need access to the model context. So we'll create an environment variable using the model context key path to create that context variable. And since this is going to be presented as a modal sheet, we'll need to access the environment's dismiss key path to create another variable called dismiss. Now, to ensure that we don't create another tally with the same name, I'll need to know what all of the names are. So let's use a query to get all of the tallies. Sort order doesn't matter. And then when I create a new tally, I want to be able to set the selected one to the new one. So I'll need to pass in the existing tally, if there is one, as a binding. And it'll be optional. Now I'm going to use a simple text view to get the name. So I'll need another state variable for that, and I'll initialize it as an empty string. To fix the preview, I'll just add a constant of nil for the selected tally. Well, now that we've got all of this, we can create our view. So I'm going to replace the body with a navigation stack. And inside there, I'll create a VStack. As the first view in the VStack, I'll create a text field with the string name bound to the name variable. And then I'm going to set the text field style to rounded border. And for the second view, we'll create a button with the string add. For the action, we'll create a new tally as a tally, passing in the name from our text field. And then we'll use the context to insert it into our database, and then use the context to try and save, and then dismiss the view. Let's set the button style to bordered. We'll set a frame of max width to infinity and an alignment of trailing. Then I'll make the button disabled if the name is empty, or if we use a map function on all of our tallies to get an array of name, and if that name contains our name, our selected name that we've entered into the text field. And then I'll add a spacer. I'll add some padding to the VStack and set the navigation title to new tally and set the navigation bar style to inline. And I can then create a toolbar with a single button where the action is dismiss. And for the label, we use an image that is the system name xmark.circle.fill. And that's our view. So let's return to our TallySelectionView and present this view as a modal sheet. Before we do that, however, if we do have tallies, why don't we display the first one when our app launches? So create an onAppear block. And then if the tallies is not empty, so not tallies is empty, we'll set the selected tally to be equal to our first tallies. And then we can force unwrap that. So let's create a new Boolean state property called newTally and initialize it as false. Then we can create a sheet modifier to the view that is bound to this new property with it is presented. And then we can present the NewTally view passing in our selected tally as the selected tally. And then I can use presentation detents, and I'll specify a single height of 250 in the array. Well, I want to be able to delete one too, so let's create a toolbar. And then inside there, create a toolbar group where the placement is top bar trailing. So for the first button, if the tallies is not empty, I want to create that button to delete the selected one. So if not tallies is empty, we'll create the button. For the label then, I'll just use an image with the system name trash. And I'll set the foreground style to red. And then within the action, I can use an if-let to unwrap the selected tally, and then use the context to delete it. And of course, we can call the try and save. And then check to see if tallies is not empty again. And if it isn't, we'll set the selected tally to the first one. And then within the group, we'll create another button. And this action will be to toggle that new tally variable. So the label will be an image using the system image plus .circle.fill. Now, notice how my preview has crashed? Well, one way to fix this is to exit Xcode and reopen it. Another way is to go to the editor menu and choose Canvas, use legacy previews execution. And I just read about this, but I'm not sure about this, so I may go back and just do a restart. Anyway, let me increase the size of that add button to a large image scale. So I'm going to test on the simulator. When I run, I get that content unavailable view because there are no tallies, so let's create one. Should have selected it. I'll fix that in a minute. So let's create another one. Let's delete it. Good, at least it displays the first one here. So let me check my code of that NewTally view. Oh, I can see in my add action, I forgot to set the selected tally to the new tally. Let's test again. Let me recreate beta. Great, that works now. It was set at beta when I created it. Well, I can do a single tap to increase the tally. And if I double tap, it decreases it. And if I tap the reset button, it switches back to 0. Well, let me switch to the alpha tally and increment. I'm going to stop the application. And when I run again, I see that the value has persisted at 3. So we're getting persistence with SwiftData. So now, after finishing this video, it bothered me that this app is crashing in the preview and giving me that. Well, I check the editor menu and the canvas again, and I see that I'm not using this legacy property execution. Now watch this. I can now tap to increase the value count in the preview. And I can tap the reset button. I can even add a new tally and delete it. I wish I could tell you why it's working for me now and it wasn't before, and it'll probably break again in the future. Previews are still a bit of a mystery, but even despite that, I really like using them when I'm designing, so I'm going to put up with the crashes and the issues. Well, that's it for this video, and I hope you've learned something that you can use in your projects going forward, but there's still a lot more to come. So I hope you'll join me in the next video in this series where we'll add a new target for our widgets, as well as an app group so that we can share the tally data between our iOS target and the widget target. So if you've enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment below. And make sure you subscribe to my channel and enable notifications so that you're made aware of new videos that I release. But you can also download my free channel listing app to be able to search for and find content from any one of my close to 350 Swift and SwiftUI related videos.